just a moment to reflect on the promise of community action. We are about changing people's lives, embodying the spirit of hope, improving communities, and making America a better place to live. We, Community Action, care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Such a great moment to reflect on all that we are about and all that we are to do. So with that reflection, I am happy to turn our webinar over to Melanie. She is a long-standing partner in relationship to our work in fulfilling our promise of community action. So Melanie, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you everyone. Be sure to use the chat, and I'll come back on at the end.
Thank you so much, Lana, and thank you, Denise, and welcome to everybody who's signed on to hear the live program. It's really my pleasure to be the presenter for this session. As you'll see on this slide, you've got my full name, my phone number, which is my office number, which is where I live during the business day, and also my email address. Just as a reminder, if you have a question about any risk topic, if you want to talk to somebody about something that's happening in your agency with respect to risk, what we're talking about today, or any risk topic, don't hesitate to reach out. We provide free technical assistance to community action agency leaders. And when I look at my business phone and see the caller ID that it's coming from a community action agency, I'm always very excited because I know I'm going to talk to somebody who's part of a community that I really believe in. So don't hesitate to reach out, and you can reach me on that number that you see on the slide. Just as a reminder, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center is a nonprofit, and I have been the executive director for almost 25 years, coming up on my 25th anniversary here. We think our mission is amazing as well. We work to help leaders in the nonprofit sector really embrace risk and get more comfortable with risks they face so they can ultimately take more risk and take those bold risks that we all need to take to achieve our missions. So as you saw in the session description, we talked a little bit about what data equity refers to and promised that we will discuss some of the risks of failing to recognize that data are not neutral and how to address those risks. So we're going to jump right into the content. So I've organized my comments today into these three buckets. We're going to start with what is data equity and why do you need it? And then we'll explore these three principles for equitable data practices, and then close with tips for building data projects with an equity lens. I really hope this content is helpful, and I hope my explanation of the content is helpful. I think you will find the slide deck to be useful as you go back and review your notes and think about how you can apply these concepts to your own organization and to the data collection and data analysis work that you're no doubt doing. And as you heard from Denise, the full slide deck will be available to you along with the recording if you decide that someone else in your agency would benefit from hearing this material as well. So let's jump into the first of the three topics, and that is, what is data equity and why do you need it? So when we use the term data equity, we're referring to all aspects of the data cycle, right? Design, collection, analysis, interpretation, and dissemination, all aspects of that cycle of doing that work with an equity lens. Data equity also focuses on ensuring that marginalized groups both have access to data and that the group collecting and analyzing and disseminating the data is working to eliminate any potential harm that could be caused to those groups from data misuse. Data equity also refers to consideration of how data can reinforce stereotypes and can exacerbate racial biases and undermine social justice. So there's a lot to it, right? It's not just a simple short sentence description. There's really a lot to the concept of data equity. And I think that beyond reading through these three components and listening to me talk about these three elements, I think this is a topic that takes a little bit of time to sink in. And even after the concept has sunk in a bit, it takes time to figure out how will this apply to the work I'm doing. And that may not come to you at this very moment or during this session today, but it may be tomorrow or next week or months from now that you realize, that topic has a lot of relevancy to the work I'm doing. And it may be that kind of aha or that light bulb moment happens when you're in the middle of designing a survey of some sort, or reviewing the results of a survey, or even putting together a report that shares some of the data that you've collected. So I think this is one of those topics where those aha moments may happen over time and not be immediate, but I do think there's just tremendous insights and opportunities in this topic. So I wanted to share this quote from Paula Dressel at the Race Matters Institute. She says, "The route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally. It will be achieved by treating everyone justly according to their circumstances." This is an incredibly profound statement, and it's one that I want to keep up in front of me and refer to, over and over again. It's pointing out to some extent the differences between equity, equality, and justice, which we're going to talk about next, but really, really compelling statement. So I encourage you to reflect on this after the program. So what I'm showing now is really what I think is a compelling visual that tells the story of the differences between inequality versus equality and equity, and even presents an argument for justice. So I want you to look at this visual with me. So inequality exists when there is unequal access to opportunities. So it's just like this tree. If you look at the top left-hand corner, that first graphic that's labeled inequality, the tree is leaning towards the person in the red jumpsuit, and its fruit is also heavily weighted to that side. So this is kind of a great depiction of what inequality looks like. So if we move our eyes to the right of the screen and look at the box that's labeled equality, in this illustration, each group has the same tools. Each person is standing on a ladder of the same height, but it has nothing to do with or does nothing to account for the disparities that contribute to the unequal playing field. In the image, both people are given those ladders of equal height, yet the tree is still leaning toward the left, making the fruit out of reach for the person who is on the right. So they have the same size ladder, the ladder at the same height, but one person can reach the fruit in the tree and one person cannot. So then if we look at the bottom left-hand image in this graphic, this is the equity graphic. Equity recognizes the different challenges each person has and addresses this by providing a customized tool to allow access for everyone. So the problem of the tree being weighted and leaning to one side isn't solved, but with a taller ladder, the person on the right is able to reach the fruit. So they're both able to reach the fruit using different tools. And then justice is the final step. So that's that image in the bottom right-hand corner. Justice is achieved when mechanisms are put in place that correct the system to offer equitable tools, as well as opportunities for all parties. So in that bottom right-hand image, we're seeing this fruit tree and the two individuals trying to reach the fruit, but the tree is both staked and propped up. And as a result, the fruit is more evenly distributed. So both of the individuals in this image can enjoy an ample harvest. So they can both reach the same amount of fruit. Data collection and analysis can either support equity and justice, or it can widen the gap in existing community inequities. Equity is a solution for addressing imbalanced social systems. Justice can take equity one step further by fixing the very systems in a way that leads to long-term, sustainable, equitable access for generations to come. I also wanted to share a couple of statements from the Office for Creative Research, and I thought these were really helpful in understanding these concepts as well. And the authors say it's all too easy to forget that data is basically about human beings and their behaviors. It's not something that's abstract. And they say that the social development sector, so they're talking about all of us, is prone to forgetting this. And that we sometimes or often collect data with very little regard for the people behind the numbers that we collect. And they also say that, data captures not only our stories, but our tastes and interests and also hopes and fears. And it really isn't abstract at all. It is and is ultimately human, right? It can be and is ultimately human, as they say. While data are often represented by numbers, so sometimes we think of data as being numbers, not all data is numeric. The very thing that these numbers signify are actual real world situations and real world people. And so this makes data the opposite of being neutral, right? So it's not neutral at all. Another factor that really contributes to this non-neutrality of data are the biases of those who are involved in collecting, analyzing, and sharing data sets. So data is not neutral because people, right, who have biases, decide which data matters, how will data collection take place, how will data be analyzed, and how will results be shared and distributed. So when people are involved, biases come into play, and the result is not neutral. So why is data equity important? Why is this something that we should all be spending time thinking about and trying to apply some of these concepts to the work that we do? I want to share 5 reasons. So the first reason is that biased data can actually skew results. Data that is designed, collected, analyzed, and presented with an equity lens is more accurate. It actually tells the whole story instead of a partial story. The second is this concept of trustworthiness. So trustworthy data can not only be safely shared, but it can be reused. It can be helpful down the road as well. This extends the life of data and it makes projects more meaningful. And data projects really get more bang for the buck. So there's an opportunity to achieve some cost savings if you can reuse data that you've collected for multiple projects or initiatives or for multiple purposes. The third reason is that equitable data is people-centric and it gives layers to filter data projects that tell a more complete story. So valuable insights will help you make more positive change for your mission. The fourth reason is that it's actionable. So there's less risk in designing action items from equitable data projects because the data is more accurate and trustworthy, right? So you're reducing the risk as you increase the trustworthiness of the data that you collect and analyze. And then the fifth reason is that clear and accurate data really creates this solid foundation on which to make decisions, right? So equitable data are the statistics for building a risk-framed decision-making, for making the best possible decisions in a world of continuing uncertainty. All right, let's jump into these 3 principles for equitable data practices. This is part 2 of the presentation. So these come from or were inspired by the Belmont Report, which was originally produced by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And what happened was the Urban Institute, which is an organization of social scientists and economists and communicators, adapted 3 of the ethical principles that were in the Belmont Report to guide more equitable data science projects. So this is the source behind these 3 principles, and they are beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. So we're going to talk about these kind of one at a time. All right, let's start with beneficence. So the term beneficence is often understood to mean acts of kindness or charity that go beyond strict obligation. But in this document, in this report, beneficence is understood in a much stronger sense as an obligation. And there are 2 general rules that have been created or formulated as kind of complementary expressions of beneficent actions. The first is to do no harm. And the second is to maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. So again, the first is do no harm. And number 2 is maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. So persons are treated in an ethical manner, not only by respecting their decisions and protecting them from harm, but also when you make an effort to secure their well-being. All right, so how do we apply beneficence to data equity? How do we use that term and apply it to the topic that we're talking about today? So I want to review these 5 tips that are showing up on the slide in front of you. So the first tip has to do with sensitive topics. So this could be anything from drug use to sexual behavior to voting to income. And what you want to think about is, how do we omit, where appropriate, and only include this type of these sensitive topics if the benefits outweigh the risk. So this is the risk-reward equation, if you will. So this is a reminder to all of us: don't collect data for data's sake. And if the data on sensitive topics must be included, think about reframing the questions and working with your community so it understands why you need that information, or if they have ideas for alternative options that could be used instead. So the second tip is to minimize the amount of personally identifiable information collected. So just as a reminder, PII is personally identifiable information. It's protected under privacy laws. It's actually defined under state law. So you want to make sure that you know how your state defines PII. The definitions are a little bit different, but it's information about somebody that you would not find in a phone book. So my name and my address and my phone number are not PII. My name and my credit card number, that combination is PII. That my name and my bank account number, that's PII. So the suggestion is that you use alternative identifiers, such as randomly generated IDs, instead of asking for PII, and that you only collect PII when it's absolutely needed, right? So again, you're managing the risk of inadvertent disclosure of PII if you stop and don't collect it unless it's absolutely necessary. And this tip is important for this topic that we're talking about today, data equity, risk and reward, but it's relevant to managing all sorts of risks in your organization. If you're worried about a privacy breach, you need to think about, what PII do we collect? Do we really need to collect it? Is it necessary to the work we're doing? And if we don't need it, then we should stop collecting it, because we're exposing ourselves to all sorts of potential harm and claims and losses and so forth that we don't need to be exposed to. So the third tip on the slide is called re-identification. And data is a puzzle, and skilled people can put together data that appears to be anonymous, by identifying somebody based on race in a not racially diverse area. But you want to take measures and be careful to assure the true anonymity of participants, right? So just keep in mind that you may almost be innocently asking questions and telling people this is an anonymous survey, but in fact, you can identify people. I just did a survey last week where it only involved 5 people. And afterwards, they were asking me about the survey results, and they said, how did so-and-so respond? I said, well, it was anonymous. I don't really know. And as I was saying those words, I realized, what? I don't know, but I could actually figure it out. I could look at, because somebody called me up and said, I responded to your survey 1 minute after you sent it. And somebody else said, I just responded to your survey, Monday morning. Well, by telling me that information, I could easily go back and figure out who said what in the survey. So we want to be careful when we use that term anonymous, when we promise anonymity. So number 4 on this list of tips is data interpretation. And this is a reminder that we should not analyze data in a vacuum. And we want to make sure that when we do an analysis of data, that we're allowing our community, the people that we serve, to offer their own interpretations of what the data means. And this reduces the risk that you'll get it wrong, right? That you've jumped to conclusions in your data analysis. So really important. And then the last item is to be transparent about data limitations, right? So just a reminder, don't hide negative or absent data. All of us has been in this situation where we've collected information, we've done some sort of survey or data collection, and there's a big gap. We didn't get exactly what we wanted. It's really important that we acknowledge the analytical process that was involved, the data that was included, what data wasn't collected, and also to acknowledge in some cases that no data exists. So instead of kind of burying the weaknesses in the results under the rug or pretending as though that question must not have been relevant if we don't have good data behind it. It's important to acknowledge those gaps. So that's the concept of beneficence. The second concept or principle is called respect for persons. Respect for persons. So let's talk about that next. So respect for persons incorporates at least two ethical convictions. The first is that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. And the second is that anyone with diminished autonomy is entitled to protection. All right. So the first concept is that each person should be treated as an autonomous agent. The second is that somebody with diminished autonomy should receive some protection. The principle of respect for persons has two separate moral requirements. First, the requirement to acknowledge that autonomy, and the second is that requirement to protect those who have diminished autonomy. Not every human being is capable of self-determination, and the capacity for self-determination matures during our lives. And some individuals lose this, either wholly or in part, because of aging, because of illness, because of mental disability, or circumstances that severely restrict your liberty. So respect for the immature and the incapacitated requires that we protect them as they mature or as they become incapacitated. Some people require extensive protection, even to the point of excluding them from activities which may harm them. Other people require very little protection, beyond making sure that they're able to undertake activities freely and with awareness of the possible adverse circumstances or adverse consequences of participating in a certain activity. So the extent of protection that you afford should depend on the risk of harm and the likelihood of benefit. And that judgment should apply to anyone who lacks autonomy. And it's also important that you periodically evaluate those issues, right? And that level of autonomy may differ during someone's lifetime, right? So here it is in a nutshell. We want you to recognize that individuals have autonomy and they should be able to make good and informed decisions. Some individuals, because of circumstances like illness or mental disability or age or other issues, have diminished autonomy, and we need to take proactive steps to protect them. So make sure you give adequate information so people can make decisions about participating in any data collection effort, and also decide how fully they want to participate in your data collection effort. And if your project is a passive data collection effort, right, which could be through observation, so you're observing a group of people receiving services, or maybe you're videotaping an activity, that's called passive data collection. Make sure that you provide written and or verbal notices so everybody who's being observed in that passive data collection activity is aware that they're being observed. Right? So those are the kind of ethical ways to approach that. Let's go ahead and talk about this third principle from the Belmont Report, and again, as interpreted by the Urban Institute. So something that you might not think about when you start designing a data project is what happens to the data when the project is all done? So legislation like the General Data Protection Regulation, which was adopted in the European Union a couple of years ago, that legislation clearly states that data is owned by the subject the data represents. Therefore, we need to respect the wishes of those from whom we collect data. So I want you to make sure that your project includes very clear information for how participants can request that their data be destroyed at any point during the project, and that you honor those requests. So that's kind of a big to-do item for those who've been collecting data without really thinking or imagining or understanding that the person whose data you collected still owns that data, right? They still have the right to request and expect that you will not hang on to it after the project is complete. So a couple of tips. You want to design data projects with community interest at the forefront. You want to be concise. You want to avoid collecting non-essential data or using any overly burdensome practices. You want to share data with others where possible to reduce duplication, so we don't have 2 or 3 or 4 organizations collecting the same information from the same people. You want to make sure that you're communicating the results of your data collection in a meaningful way. And you want to empower anybody whose data you collected, who you asked for information for your data collection activity, to be able to request that you destroy their data. All right, our third topic is tips for building data projects with an equity lens. Let's go on to the next slide. So the first tip is to check biases at the door. The subject of cognitive biases and stereotypes is one that's of great interest to me. It comes into play in so many different aspects of organizational life. And I think there's an inclination to imagine that others have biases and we don't, but all of us have biases. We bring biases to work every single day. Implicit biases are real. Biases can impact both the design and the analysis of data projects. So I want to encourage you to encourage your own team to explore implicit biases. Learn as much as you can. There's an interesting Harvard implicit bias test, and I actually took one of the tests this morning just to check it out. You'll see a reference to it on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. Knowing what biases you have will help you kind of expand your thinking and move past some false assumptions that biases tend to cause. I also want to encourage you to really infuse project meetings and discussions with positive stories and images relating to the groups that you're studying. And keep in mind that, those low stress situations allow team members to be open-minded rather than falling back on these habitual frames and constructs. And I would certainly encourage you to share insights on how you're dealing with biases in your organization with other leaders from community action agencies around the country. All right, this next slide shows common places for biases. And you see the source for this is Data Assist. So this is something I learned while researching this topic for today. There are 7 stages in a data project. And it's important that in identifying and working to identify biases in a data collection, data analysis project, that we stop and look at each of the stages, because we can unearth biases at each stage of the process. So the first stage is funding. So I want you to keep in mind that funders might want to direct money towards things they're comfortable with. And so it's up to us as organizations, as leaders of organizations who are seeking funding for projects, that we're trying to find funding to do research on issues that reflect actual community needs, that aren't narrowly limited by what funders happen to be comfortable with. Right? So we want to expand our own horizons, but also help our funders expand their horizons as well. The second stage is motivations. What should this project accomplish? Make sure that your motivations for a particular project are really aligned with the mission of your organization and the needs of your community. I remember when I was starting out my career as a fundraiser, as a full-time development director, one of the things that happened from time to time was we kind of chased funding. We would see that there was a pocket of money available from a certain foundation for a certain type of project, and we would often go after it thinking that any money coming into our nonprofit would be a good thing, instead of being more disciplined and recognizing that we should only be seeking funding for projects that advance our mission and serve our community, right? Such important guideposts, if you will. So the third phase is project design. So I want you to keep in mind, whose input has been solicited in this project design phase. Have we included diverse groups, people with different points of view, different life experiences, different situations, both in our agency and also in the community? Right? Or have we undertaken project design in kind of an insular way with a small group of people who think alike, act alike, have similar life experiences? So have we really taken a broad approach to project design? And then the fourth is data collection and sourcing. And so at this phase, I want you to be thinking about whether your data collection techniques and sources represent a true representation of your community to support your objectives without placing an undue burden on those that you're collecting data from. So the data you're collecting may be incredibly valuable and necessary to achieve the goal of the project, but if it places a heavy burden on those that you're collecting data from, you want to think about that risk reward, right? The reward is you're getting data you need, but the risk is causing some harm to the people you're collecting data from. And then steps 5 and 6 are in these different phases, or phases 5 and 6 of this cycle are analysis and interpretation. So I want you to be thinking about how could our biases impact the way the data is analyzed and interpreted? Could bias kind of rear its ugly head as we sift through the data that we receive? And also, are we seeking opinions and feedback from those who have lived experience, right? Who have actual knowledge of what's happening versus are just approaching it as pure outsiders. All right. And then the last phase in the cycle, or step 7 in this cycle, is communication and distribution. And I want you to be thinking about whether you're sharing data in a way that's easily accessible to those who need to use it and access it, right? So if you were just to think about bias in your data collection project or activities, you might, gather a group around a table and talk about it for 30 minutes and come to a conclusion pretty quickly. But when you break it down into these phases, this 7-phase cycle, I think you're far more likely to kind of get at the root of bias and identify some biases that really need to be stripped out of your project or removed from the project or thought of differently, understood differently to improve not only the structure, but the ethics behind the data collection and analysis project that you're undertaking. All right, let's go to my next slide, which is to organize data meaningfully. So did you know that the order that choices or items appear in a list or a chart can falsely elevate importance? So a great example of this is when you see various categories listed. If you see men listed first or white listed first, which we've all taken thousands of surveys in our lifetimes and can probably think of very few that didn't list men first and then women or white first, right? That can falsely indicate that these groups are more important or that they have more weight or that that's a more favorable outcome. So it's really interesting to kind of understand how something as simple as the order of options can have a real impact and can convey this subtle message. Another tip is to consider disaggregating data when it tells a more compelling picture. So I want to give you an example of that. So instead of showing all of your data in one chart, think about side-by-side charts with a single data set in each to kind of entice readers to consider each group individually rather than rating them against each other, right? So if you're considering, you're looking at data that's based on specific demographics, when you group it all together, it tends people to say, oh, look how this group did compared to that group, versus look at what I can learn from reviewing the data from one group and then reviewing the data from another group, right? So it's a really simple step to disaggregate data when you're presenting it so that it avoids that tendency, that biased tendency to compare and contrast and say, wow, look at how this one group compares to another, which could reinforce stereotypes. And then some questions for data organization, right? What's the focus of the project? Is there a particular segment of the community that's a primary concern? What's the story you're hoping to tell? And can you draw a quantitative relationship to how the groups are ordered? Does it make sense as you're producing this survey or this tool that you're going to use to collect data? Does it make sense to alphabetize the options or the results to order them by magnitude of effect or by the sample size. So there's a lot that goes into how we present information, and not only how we collect it, but how we present the findings of any data project. All right, so what about demographics? Well, a lot of surveys, a lot of forms that each of us encounter from time to time. Every time we visit a doctor's office or sign up for a service from a new provider, there are so many demographic questions. And I don't know about you, but I often get frustrated by all those questions that are at the beginning of the form. And I tend to wonder, like, why are they asking me this? Why do they need to know if I'm married or divorced, right? Like, I don't understand why they're asking me this question. So I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, perhaps with that or other questions. So this is a tip from a group called More Than Numbers, which suggests we use a decision tree or a flow chart to really help us understand whether certain demographic questions are essential to the data project. So a few minutes ago, I said, don't collect personally identifiable information if you can't use it, or you have no plan to use it, or you don't know how you're going to use it, right? Don't collect PII, because in doing so, you're opening your agency up to the obligation to keep that PII private. Well, similarly, don't collect demographic information that you can't use. That's not important to answering the ultimate question. So I encourage you to take a look at this decision tree from More Than Numbers and use something like this. I love decision trees, flowcharts to help me figure out how do I get to the best possible decision under the circumstances. So it's really important to think about language, and I hope you're committed and members of your team are committed to using, to being more careful, to being more thoughtful about how we use language. Language and language order can amplify biases and stereotypes, right? They can perpetuate biases or they can promote inclusion. One tip is to include multi-select checkboxes, right? Where somebody could choose multiple options versus one option. Or instead of a drop-down menu or limited options, offer open-ended questions so that when you're asking somebody about their identity, they can describe themselves in a way that's meaningful for them, versus you deciding in advance what are the permissible elements of identity. And also remember that data represents people and that we always want to use people-centric language wherever possible. And I'm going to show you that in the next slide. And wherever possible, make sure that you're giving people opportunities to self-identify, to self-describe, again, versus saying there are 4 options, which of the 4 are you? We're going to show an example of asset-based language on that next slide versus language that has a deficit orientation. This takes some thinking and doing and thoughtful reflection to kind of build this into our data collection practices. And of course, if you don't know, ask, right? If you don't know, ask. Don't make assumptions about people, about their motivations, about who they are. Really important. So on this next slide, again, some practical examples of what not to say and to try this instead, right? So you see that the first item is, instead of saying disabled, you're putting people first by saying people with disabilities, right? And instead of that kind of negative orientation with minority, you're saying people of color or BIPOC, right? Or instead of poor or low income people, you're starting with people, putting people first, people with low incomes, right? And I love the last, the tip so much, right? Instead of saying other, when you see a list of options and it's this, or other, right? That other box, it just kind of screams different, not normal, not typical. It doesn't feel good when you click other. And I even find that it doesn't feel good when I see something as simple as a survey asking what type of nonprofit are you? And none of them fit. I'm like, gosh, why are we always an other, right? We're an important organization doing great work. So instead of other, how about prefer to describe or prefer to self-describe, right? That's a very positive way. Right? It's an asset-based versus negative approach. And this last tip is to consider sharing your data with a data walk. And I'm sure some of you have used this tool before. And this is where you take the data that you've generated, you've collected, and you display it. And this example is on a poster, but you can use a tool. You can use something like Jamboard or another virtual tool to do something similar, right, in a virtual meeting. So you've got your data set, and you display it in these data stations. So on a poster or on a whiteboard that you're looking at, a virtual whiteboard. And you give each person in the room or in the virtual room the opportunity to share their thoughts and insights and reflections with each data set, right? So it's a way to kind of gather insights and reactions and reflections on a lot of data before you've drawn all the conclusions. So just kind of share that data, put it out there, and let people comment on it and take a look and try to understand it. Right, so I think that is my last tip. And this next slide has resources. So you see the first one is that More Than Numbers, a guide toward diversity, equity, and inclusion in data collection. I encourage you to check that out. The next is the Belmont Report, which I referenced when we were talking about those 3 principles. The third is Harvard's Implicit Bias tests. And as I mentioned, I took one of those tests this morning and it was really interesting. It's a timed test. And at the beginning of the test, it tells you, please don't multitask. But if you're going to do this test correctly and it's going to have value for you, just focus on this test for 12 minutes. So they tell you right up front how long it's going to take. And then the Disability Language Style Guide is from the National Center on Disability and Journalism. So that's another resource. And again, you are welcome to reach out to me with questions about anything I've talked about, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone who wants to chat about the issues in this program. If I don't know the answer, I will absolutely do some research for you and work with you to try to identify the answer. So I think I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to, I think Lana's going to take over.
Okay. Before we do that, Melanie, there is a question in the chat. So what is an example of a quality control method that you can use to ensure your interpretation is not biased? What would be a signal that your interpretation is biased?
Well, I don't know if this is a quality control method, but it's certainly something I would do is I would ask, who has interpreted this data, right? Is it just me, myself, and I? Is it me and 2 other people who look just like me and have a similar life experience? Or have I asked a truly diverse group of people to tell me what they think the data means? And that's really what that exercise that I was describing, the data walk, is all about, where you put the data up, grouped in the way it was collected or based on the groupings that felt natural as you were putting that survey together. You put the data up on a poster or on a virtual whiteboard, and you let people comment. What does this mean to you? Or another way to do it, one of the potential downsides of having people walk up and put a Post-it note on the poster or on the whiteboard is that everybody can see what the person before them put, which is interesting. But another way to do it is to have everybody write down, what does this say to you? What does this mean to you, right? And see what the variety of interpretations are, and think about and reflect on how does my interpretation differ? Is it very close to what everybody else said? Again, a diverse group of people with different life experiences, or are the interpretations of the data all over the place, right? That tells me that, wow, I'm seeing it through my lens. I sometimes talk about the fact that, each of us only has one set of lenses through which we see the world. And I happen to wear glasses, so it's kind of an easy example to use. But we all see the world in a certain way, and how we see the world and understand things, including data, is based on this collection of life experiences, right, and education. So I do think a great way to test the bias in my own interpretation is to ask people who have different life experiences, different different lived experiences, to tell me what they think the data means. So that data walk is a great exercise, but I would maybe do it a little differently than the way I described. I would have people jot down how they interpret the data, what it means to them, without first seeing how other people respond to that question.
Great, thanks. And Ashley, I appreciate your comment in the chat about focusing on language. I agree 100%. Our terminology is changing, and as a network for people who are experiencing poverty, I think it's important that we use language that is reflective of people as opposed to poverty. So I really like not using the terminology low-income people instead of saying people with a low income, because they are identified then as a person, not as low income. We've also had lots of conversations at the partnership about disabled person, saying a person with a disability is another option. Some entities are looking at uniquely able as another way to describe disabilities. So all of that is part of the conversation, I think, when we think about language.
I think I agree, Lana. I would say I'm reorienting myself to say, put people first, people with disabilities, right? Versus projecting on somebody, you are a disabled person. So just a good rule of thumb.
I've been in community action for a very long time, and I think this is the biggest intentional shift in language that I've experienced in my 25 or more years working in this network. So I very much appreciate the intentionality that we use when we talk about the people we serve and people in our communities. So I think that's everything there. Melanie, anything you'd like to add before we go on to our slides?
Just a reminder that you have my contact information on that slide previous to this one, as well as that first slide. Please call me if you want to chat. And if you want to provide some one-on-one feedback, I always appreciate that. And just any question about any risk topic, I'm really happy to hear from you. So take advantage of that and let me know that we met during this session.
Okay, great. And if you'd want to mute so we lose that echo, I just would like to thank everyone for being here today. I want to show you some of the upcoming webinars that we have planned for you. This first one is going to be next week on March 24th. Keeping the Human in Human Services, Tips for Implementing User-Centered Design. This is a webinar series we are doing in partnership with U.S. Digital Response. They are a network of more than 6,000 technology experts who will provide guidance and support to community action agencies in the implementation of changes in their technology. And the most important thing to know is that it's free. Yes, free, F-R-E-E. 6,000 experts that we can tap into to get some free support on some technology changes for local community action agencies. And then the next webinar, or another webinar we have coming up, is social media digital template resources for community action agencies. This is a project that I have been working on with the CARES project in partnership with Strategic America, which is a national firm that does a lot of marketing. We have designed templates for every local community action agency to use to tell the story of your response to the pandemic. And so in this webinar, we will show you all of those tools and templates, and you'll be able to learn how to use them in sharing the difference that you are making for the people that we serve in the communities where we provide programs and services. We have another webinar with U.S. Digital Response, Adapting to Remote Processes, Tips for Improving Digitized Workflows. That's a hard word for me to say. And again, these are some of our technology experts that volunteer their time to help nonprofits. And then, I think we're back to Melanie. My slides are mixed up, sorry. And she will be be doing another webinar for us in our series with her. So feel free to access any of those webinars and to get registered. And I think last but not least, we have our Equity Summit coming up. Everyone in Community Action is encouraged to participate in the Equity Summit, and the registration link is there. You can also find it on our website. And in addition to that, it's in the e-news that comes out on Fridays. There we go. Thanks for pulling that up for me. I don't know what happened to my slides, but all right. Thank you, everyone. It was great to be with you today in our webinar series, and keep up the good work. And we will be available next Wednesday with our next webinar. And reach out to Melanie with any questions, comments, suggestions, or requesting assistance. Thank you.